Okay, so what we've done so far is manually parse an XML document, right? Element by element, attribute by attribute, iterating over each one of the rows of the result sets, right? So that's the equivalent of using kind of like JDBC, right? Where you connect to the database and you retrieve the records and you retrieve each one of the fields and the result set and do that manually, yes? And we saw how painful that was, right? Of having to manage that ourselves. And that was only just reading the raw data, right? Imagine that we need to perhaps instantiate from that a Java model, right? That you would have to instantiate the Java objects, and then populate it with all the values that you're reading from an XML document. That would be very painful, right? Very much like working with raw JDBC was painful, yes? So we want to automate some of this, right? Once you've done this several times, right? You've done it for students, you've done it for movies, you start finding a pattern, right? It's pretty much the same thing always, right? Get me the elements, cast them to whether elements or attributes, parse them one at a time, right? Cast them to the right data types, and then instantiate whatever Java model it is, right? So what I'd like to be able to do is very much like we did with JDBC, and once we've done one data model, one DAO, we find a pattern. It says, ooh, wouldn't it be nice if we could automate a lot of this, right? If we could have a mapping, automatic mapping between a Java data model and a relational data model, right? So same thing is the same question that we would like to be able to answer here. Could we perhaps have an automatic mapping of data models, right? And that's exactly what Jaxb does. Jaxb allows us to, instead of us managing the nitty-gritty details of having to map XML schemas to Java schemas, Jaxb allows us to do that automatically. So for instance, we can take a look at a Java data model that would be an equivalent to the XML schema, right? We see that the XML document has a particular structure, that you have IDs, you have first names, they have last names, they have the name of an element, right? All these tag names have names, right? Like student, first name, and whatnot, right? And so we could maybe dream up an equivalent Java data model for this XML schema. One that perhaps could have identical names for the classes or for the field names, right? Perhaps considering the fact that perhaps XML might have a different case, right? Or might be case insensitive or case sensitive, or might have a different naming convention. Right, that Java has a particular naming convention, right? That classes are capitalized, that the fields are typically camel cased, right? They're all lowercase in the second letter, and then the letters are capitalized. So just taking into account those idiosyncrasies, those minutia, perhaps we could automate the conversion of one data model to the other data model, just like we took a look at JPA. JPA did that for us, didn't it? Right? It was an ORM, it was an object relational mapping mechanism that mapped a relational database to an object-oriented database. Jaxb tries to do the same thing and map data models that are implemented in XML to data models that are implemented in Java. As long as you play within certain constraints. Yes? So let's take a look at Jaxb. So the first thing would be to create the Java model, right, that would be somewhat equivalent to the XML data model, right? So the first couple of things is that you need to provide a constructor, very much like we did in Java, right, when we were creating JPA data models, right? We created an entity, right? We created all sorts of private properties, and then we provided all the setters and getters. And we declared a no argument constructor, right? The default constructor. Actually, I don't think we even declared it, but you get that for free in Java, right? If you don't declare your own. So at least you have to have the no argument constructor. You have all the setters and getters for each one of the attributes, and that's it. That's all you really need to do. You have just a plain old Java object, right? And then the next step was to somewhat use some of the glue that mapped the Java classes to a relational model. And we did that by using the JPA entity and the JPA at ID and generated values. Remember that, right? And the one-to-many, the many-to-many. There were a whole bunch of annotations that map the Java object model to the relational model. So equivalent to this, Jaxb provides all sorts of annotations that allow us to map a Java data model to an XML data model. And we do this by using the following annotations. So for instance, the @XML root element, you might guess what that does, right? That maps it to the root element in XML. So presumably there should be some XML root element called student. Right? So by default, right, we take the name of the class, right, would be mapped to the same element name that is a root. Right? And very much like in JPA, you can override all these defaults. Right? Just like in JPA, the default name of the table was the name of the class. Right? Then the default name of the fields were the names of the properties. Yes? But all that could be overwritten. Right? You can say, well, no, I don't want that table name. Use this other table name. And I don't want those column names. Use these other column names. Same thing here. Right? If you don't say anything, it'll take the default names. Right? So for instance, the student class will be mapped to a student root element, and the attributes, right? The elements inside of the class will be mapped to elements and attributes in the XML document. So for instance, here in Java, these are the attributes that we have, right? String, ID, first name, and last name. There's no distinction here that certain things can be captured as attributes or could be captured as elements, whereas XML does make a distinction, right? In XML, data could be either captured in the body of an element or it could be captured as the value part of an attribute. So XML allows for this, right? Whereas Java has no distinction. It's just an attribute. So to distinguish this, we have a dedicated annotations such as @XML attribute and @XML element. It says, well, where do you want me to store the data? Do you want me to store it and map it to an attribute, or do you want me to map it as an attribute, as an element, as an embedded element? So here we're annotating the set ID and the set first name. That's another idiosyncrasy. Jaxb, in Jaxb, you annotate the setters. You annotate the setters. Okay. In JPA, there was no annotation whatsoever. Right. You didn't have to even annotate the attributes. Right. It would take the name of the attributes. It would map them to all equivalent fields in the table. Yes. And by default, it would take the name of the attribute was the name of the field. Except if you had a camel casing, right? It added an underscore. Right? But other than that, the fields were mapped to the properties of the class were mapped to fields in the table. Here you have to annotate each element that you want converted. Right? The ones you do not annotate will be ignored. Okay? And also you annotate the setters, right? Not the getters, not the attributes, but the setters. Okay? Once you have annotated all the fields, presumably the first name and last name would be @XML elements, and the attribute, the ID would be XML attribute. Then you can use Jaxb to do the conversion. Right? This is very much like in JPA. You need a repository, right? The repository was the entry point that gave you all the API to read or write from the database. Once you told it what it is that you were reading or writing, right? In the repository, you said, I want to create a CRUD repository that allows me to save students or sections or courses or what it is, whatever it was. Yes, you configured it. You told it what it is that you want to insert or update or delete. You need to tell it, and also tell it the primary key. Yes, here it's similar, but a different syntax, just a different syntax. Here, you create what are called Jaxb context. Jaxb context, right? It's very similar to a repository. It plays the same role, right? The repository is used to bridge the gap between the object model and a relational model. Here, the Jaxb context is used to bridge the gap between the Java data model and the XML data model. Okay? You have to configure it. What is it that you're writing to XML, or what is it that you're reading from XML? I'm reading and writing a student.class. That's what I'm reading and writing, right? And it'll map to some XML representation of that Java model. Yes, right? And then there's an additional step is that here it's a little bit different of interacting with a relational database, in that here we are dealing with stream data that could be streamed across the network, right? That can be converted into an ASCII representation, right? And it can be sent over a network. Okay. In this case, the data might be stored in just a plain old XML document. In this case, right? So it's considered to be a stream input or a stream output. Okay. And you can either read from it or write to the stream. All right. And those two operations have a historical name to them, right? When you are converting some object representation into a stream data, we say that we are marshalling the data, right? We are converting it from some object CPU representation into a streaming of bytes, right? That are going to be traveling across some stream, and at some other point is going to be unmarshaled and made concrete into some storage. Okay, so to that end, the API that is used to convert from a stream into RAM, or from RAM into a stream, are called marshalers and unmarshalers. Okay, so in this case, we are going to we're going to marshal, right, which is going to allow us to write to a file. So to write to a file, you instantiate a marshaler. The marshaler is going to convert the RAM representation of your object instance. Is going to convert it into a stream of bytes that are eventually going to end up in a file. Yes? Okay. So what are you going to marshal? A student class instance. That's what we're marshaling. So I have some object student instance, and I'm going to marshal it, convert it into a whole bunch of streams of bytes into a file. There we go. So we have our marshaler. We can configure it. You can configure the marshaler, whether you want to format it. Maybe you want to add white spaces and tabs and whatnot. By default, it'll write it in a single line. Right? So it'll be really hard for us to read for us humans. So we're asking it to please format it, add the extra new lines and the tabs and whatnot, so that our frontal cortex can read the file and make sense out of it. By default, it'll be just one very long stream of bytes, right? One ASCII character after the other. So we're formatting it. We're saying marshaler.jaxb formatted output. True, yes, I want to format it. And here's the file I want you to marshal it to. The alice.xml. So we'll say jaxb marshaler.marshal alice. Alice is presumably an instance of some object of Alice that represents a single instance of student, and we're writing it to alice.xml. Make sense? Or we can go the other way around. Here's another example of writing a movie of Blade Runner. So as an example of writing the movie, it's just the same example but a different instance. So here we're instantiating Blade Runner. I forget if this is the first one or the newer one, and we're writing Blade Runner to XML, blade.xml. Okay. Okay, I think I have the slides wrong. Okay, this is reading. Let's take a look at reading.